Hi everyone, welcome back to Camp Conversations Parenting Edition. I am Dayna Haig-Conway. I have a master's in counseling psychology and a graduate degree in education, former teacher, and currently a clinical counselor that also offers coaching and courses virtually through Camp Mental Health. I love all of the questions that we have been getting, so I want to dive right into them today. So, our main questions today, as I was going through them, are centralized around divorce. There was one specific question from a teacher of elementary school, it looks like grade 3, about how do we help children transitioning back and forth between their homes when we can see it's obviously affecting how they're showing up in the classroom and causing some dysregulation. And another question was from a parent currently going through a divorce and wondering how to support their children. I'm going to answer both of these questions simultaneously, and I might be able to drop out of the questions and start to answer some specifics from either the parenting end or from the classroom end. All right, bear with me. I've made some notes for this one. So speaking to the dysregulation that children feel as they transition between their two homes, our first step is to, either as the teacher or the parent, jump back to ourselves. How is this and how the child is showing up impacting me? What are my needs? What is this triggering within me? So if I am the teacher in that classroom, am I kind of am I thinking that I see a pattern between which house that child is coming from, or whether it's transition day or not transition day, to how that child is going to show up in my classroom? And is that pattern that I think I'm noticing helping or hindering my relationship with that child? Is it helping or hindering how I am showing up for that child? Same thing going on for the parent going through the divorce. I can only imagine how challenging a time this is for you right now, and I just want to honor your bravery for writing in and asking this question. It really shows me how much you care and you love your family. And so what is going on for you? And do you have resources to support you and your own regulation and fears and worries for both yourself and for your child? Because we need to primarily, just like when we show up on a first aid scene when there's an injury, our first step is always checking in with us and our own safety so that we are able to tap into that logical brain and follow are really important steps of checking in with the patient. In this case, the patient is our child, and the first aid scene is helping them regulate after our separation, or the first aid patient is our student, and the scene is helping them with their regulation during either transition day or with dealing with a recent separation. And our first step is us. Why is our first step us? I think about this similar to how I think about snorkeling. I know this is going to be a little bit of a weird, seemingly far-fetched connection, but every time I go snorkeling, I am irrationally petrified of sharks. And so when I'm snorkeling, I really want to see like the beautiful fish cruising past me. I love the little tiny world underneath me, and I really want to get close and enjoy the moment. But it's almost like there's this hand in front of my face, and that hand has shark written all over it. There's pictures of shark. And so as soon as I enter the water, everything that I try to engage with and be with in a natural way is impacted by this thought that the shark is coming. And so even if this fish that I really want to see swims up next to me, my first response to it is probably going to be to look over at it quickly with tension and a sort of panicked reaction as if the fish is a shark before my brain can then catch that it's a fish. I'm able to regulate myself and respond in the way that I want to be around that fish and actually enjoy the moment. So the shark thought is like a hand in front of my face. How does this connect back to children that are dealing with divorce? The hand in front of our face is our expectations of what they are going to be like as a result of the transition or as a result of the recent changes. And if we let that hand stay in front of our face, we won't be able to show up for the child in a way that understands their needs. The hand is going to be all about what are our needs? How do I need to approach them? It will be more me focused. And so we have to take a moment to reflect on what is the hand that I have up in front of my face? Is the hand that when I was young, my parents separated and I had a tough time, so I'm assuming this child's having a tough time? Is it that I've watched other kids go through separation and it really dysregulated them, so I'm expecting this child to be dysregulated? What is the hand in front of your face and how is it causing you to show up for that child? And is it in a positive way or a negative way? A helpful way or an unhelpful way? So step number 1, let's do that hand analogy or shark analogy, whatever you want to call it. But I want you to do some reflective work. How do I expect this child to show up as a result? And what is that expectation doing for our relationship? Step number 2. If we see this child is struggling, again, we're not going to assume why the struggle is happening. Where we go with this is we start by asking the question, why does their behavior make sense? Can I start highlighting what I'm seeing and talk about with that kid why it might make sense? I'm going to go back to the teacher question first. One of the most interesting things I ever did in my time in school was I did an anonymous survey of elementary school students at the 4 schools that I was a school counselor at. And I asked them, if there was one thing that we as the staff here could do differently to make you feel more welcome, to make you feel safer, what would that be? And it was something like 83% of the students wrote back, if we could have a weekly check-in, I think I would do better. And they started laying out the things they thought they would be better at. I think I would do better academically because I would feel safe. I think I would have more confidence. I think I would ask for more help. So when I'm talking about chatting with the student about why it makes sense, in a dream world, and I know teachers, you guys are stretched so thin and you do the best you can. In a dream world, this would be a check-in. This could also look like a journal prompt for your class, depending on the age of your students. This could also look like weekly class-wide check-ins. And what we're looking for is more for the adult in the relationship to share why dysregulation makes sense. This doesn't have to be specific to divorce. So if I were to do a weekly class-wide session, it would be something like all gathering together and having a discussion where I said, hey, you know what, this week, like every week, I noticed we had some highs, I noticed we had some lows. The highs make sense because we had skating this week. We got to go swimming this week, and a lot of you really enjoy that. It was a special day or creative writing this week, and I've noticed many of you enjoy that. The lows make sense because you guys have a lot going on at home. And sometimes when there's challenges at home, those transfer back to the school. The lows make sense because attending school 5 days in a row is exhausting. Why behavior makes sense is something that we as the adult do our best to guess at, not with the goal of guessing it right, but the goal of saying, hey, if there are elephants in this room, I am able to talk about all of them. And I'm going to kind of show you that by guessing some of the elephants in this room that are a result of the age you're at, the developmental level you're at. So if any of those elephants start to pop up in your own mind, you can come talk to me about it. You know that because I've shown you I am open to having tough conversations. So as a classroom teacher, if I notice that this year in particular has a few students going through something like separation, like family changes, like moves, like friend loss, I would have this weekly conversation where I highlight some of the things that I noticed in the classroom, not to pick kids out in particular, but just to notice. Yes, it's normal. We have highs and lows and we can talk about them as a group. And then in my group circle, I start talking about why some of these things make sense. And as my classroom gets used to this, and yes, this is what I used to do as a teacher, especially in outdoor education. As my group or my classroom gets used to this, then we open it up more as a sharing circle where we can start talking about things that we've seen and why those things make sense. And we talk about them from the group perspective, not to pinpoint out individuals. So Tuesday was particularly hard because we had track and field in the morning. So you guys burnt a lot of energy, and then we had that math test in the afternoon. Oh, everyone was exhausted. We talk about things in general terms, why they make sense. This ties back to those kids that are struggling with the transition from one house to another because you've shown them, hey, I don't expect you to show up here in the yellow zone or the green zone or whatever we want to call the good zone every single day. And I'm open to talk to you about what it's like when you show up in other zones, other emotions. I'm here. For the parent who is supporting their child that's going through separation, I work with parents to approach it the same way. We talk about all the things that would make sense to feel, the things that would make sense to be worried about, the things that make sense to feel good about. So maybe some of those things are, we're worried about going back. It would make sense if you feel a little bit worried about having to transition between two homes. It would make sense if you're feeling uncomfortable with the idea that you're going to be with one of us when you might want the other. It makes sense for you to feel a little relieved because there was a lot of fighting happening, and now you know that that's going to stop. We can talk about all of the things that would make sense for them to experience with the separation. Why do we do this? Because if we can talk about all of the things that make sense, then when I experience them as the kid, I no longer have shame or embarrassment or worry attached to them. If I have these more uncomfortable emotions attached to some of my thoughts, then when that thought comes up, it puts me into a stress state, and it doesn't allow me to engage with that prefrontal cortex to then have a conversation with my parent around, I'm scared of this, or I'm worried about this, because my brain is turned off into that stress state. We want to keep our little kiddos' brains engaged, our big kiddos too. We want them to be able to bring anything forward without moving back into that, what some people call the reptilian brain, where we're in that fight, flight, or freeze. So again, this elephant analogy of the elephant in the room. I, as your parent, can talk about any of the elephants. And I'm going to show you that by naming a few that you might be having, or a few that I experienced when my parents separated, or a few that I've heard kids experience when their parents separate, so that if you're experiencing any of these, you can either agree with me without having to come up with it on your own, or what my real goal is to get you to tell me I'm wrong and correct me with what it is you are experiencing. So why does the behavior make sense? Let's flip back to the school piece. If we just jump into teaching kids having a hard time regulation strategies, then we are completely ignoring what is going on behind the behavior. And yes, those regulation strategies might work in the short term, but they're not addressing the root cause. We need to jump into the root cause. So with that child that's having trouble going back and forth, one adaptation I can make in my classroom is to have a consistent morning check-in routine that child knows will always happen. So that might be a check-in with me, that might be a journal entry, that might be a soft start, but I would adapt my ideally whole class routine to have a consistent morning regulation activity, calm down activity, because I always say for one kid that's the squeaky wheel in the classroom, there's 5 or 6 kids that have already learned how to quiet that squeaky wheel but are still suffering with the same needs behind the behavior. So we make that class-wide morning regulation check-in strategy. Then if the behavior moves to a point where, you're having to intervene or deal directly with that child, we can talk to them from the why it makes sense standpoint. And that way we're reducing the shame so that we can have a collaborative conversation on what might be helpful. Maybe it's helpful for them if you had an email or a phone call so that you knew when the transition days were. Maybe it would be helpful for them if they had some sort of special item that transitioned with them from one house to another house and also to school so that it got to be involved. Maybe it would be helpful for them if you were able to talk to both their parents about how hard a time the child is having. But none of these interventions will work until this child feels like you are on their team against the problem. How do you show them you're on their team against the problem? You talk to them about what you're seeing and why it makes sense. Not to guess it perfectly, for them to correct you and have a conversation with you about it. For the parent at home, in an ideal world, there will be consistency between the two homes. Consistency in routines such as bedtime or mealtime. Maybe part of your collaboration or collaborative talk with them is about having a special case that's going back and forth. Even as a clinical counselor, I think right away when I hear divorce, one of my biggest biases going into it with kids is that this is about having to be at 2 different houses with 2 different sets of rules. And when I was working with a child, I approached it that way. I said, you know what, it makes sense that you're having trouble going back and forth between your parents' house because there's likely going to be different rules at different houses, because likely there's going to be different foods at different houses, different beds, different spaces. And the kid turned to me, and again, my goal of these guesses is for them to correct me. That doesn't have to do with any of it. And I said, oh, okay. And they said, I just hate going back and forth between the houses because I really just hate having to pack a bag all the time. And he's like, hasn't that ever happened to you where there's a trip that you really, really want to go on and you just don't want to go on it because actually getting there, like packing the bag, thinking about how many pairs of underwear you need, how many socks you need, is just so annoying? I had to laugh out loud because I was actually getting ready for a trip that I was really excited about. And yes, that thought of having to pack the bag, think about what I needed, run through my head what we would be doing on each day was exhausting for me and was deterring me from going on the trip. And I would have never learned that from this child because this child was shut down, would not answer open-ended questions unless I had started guessing why it makes sense. And they realized they could say anything at all. And then our collaborative discussion turned into, okay, well, how do we make the transition itself easier? And there were a lot of very simple solutions to that. And so my biggest takeaway from my experiences of working with kids is we can never come in with that hand in front of our face, that expectation of what their experience is, that assumption of what that experience is. And how do we take that hand away from our face? We, one, have a pause and think back. Okay, what are my biases around the solution? Are my biases that divorce is bad for children? Are my biases that, yes, this is going to guarantee dysregulation? Are my biases that the dysregulation I'm seeing in my classroom are because of the divorce? And if I have these biases, let's just check in. Where are they coming from? And then to debunk them further, I'm going to talk to the kid and talk about, hey, this is what I'm seeing. This is why I think it makes sense. Because this is kind of common at your age, or because this was an experience I had. And then get them to correct you and tell them what they really are experiencing. Why don't they answer open-ended questions? Hey, is this because you're going to your mom's house? Is it hard being at your mom's house? I just gave you 2 examples of closed questions. But why do they have a hard time answering closed questions or open questions? Tell me about what it's like going to your mom's house. One, because as adults, as kids, we start to guess when we're having a tough time what the other person wants to hear, and that can shut us down. 2, because there's so much going on that we just don't even want to open that can of worms. Maybe we don't trust that person. Maybe we don't trust ourselves not to have a big outburst. Or 3, because we can't actually put it into words yet. There's just a whole lot going on inside us, and we're not quite sure how to narrow it down. Talking about why it makes sense helps regulate us. When I'm struggling with something and someone sees me and they're like, you know, it makes sense you're having a tough time right now. You're a busy mom. You've got a lot on your plate. You're trying to work a new job, etc., etc. It gives me a chance to be like, oh, yeah, those are the things. No, actually, none of those things are bothering me. I'm having a hard time because it helps me work through it. So why does it make sense? If you want to take this one last step deeper, if you are the parent, or if you are a teacher that has somehow miraculously has a little more one-to-one time, or maybe you're a school counselor or school nurse, I talk about why it makes sense from 3 main standpoints. Why does it make sense from the point that connection has changed when divorce has happened? So it makes sense that you're having a tough time right now because some of the relationships in your life have changed, because who you get to see before you go down to sleep is different. I talk about it from a connection standpoint. I talk about it from autonomy or control standpoint. You know what? It makes sense you're having a tough time right now because divorce is so entirely, completely out of your control. And whether or not you're silly in the classroom is in your control. And that can feel really good to have something back in your control, right? So why it makes sense. And finally, from a purpose standpoint, it makes sense you're having a tough time because sometimes when big things like this change, we start to question, well, my parents told me they love each other and now they no longer live together. So does that mean love ends? Does that mean they still love me? Does that mean families can change? And if families can change, does that mean my parents can just choose not to be parents? Depending on the age, we're talking about why it makes sense. This doesn't mean that we allow behaviors that aren't safe in our space, that aren't part of our values in our space. We still hold our boundaries and limits. Just before we put that boundary and limit reminder or collaborative talk of how we hold it, we first say why it makes sense to take the shame away and to open up more constructive conversations around how to support children going through something as big as divorce. I can't wait to hear your follow-up questions on this, whether any of this resonated with you or was helpful. Please continue to reach out, to message through any social media of Camp Mental Health and let us know your questions, or email them to info@Camp Mental Health, and we will continue to answer them. Thanks again. Continue to check us out at www.campmentalhealth.com. Talk to you next week.